Fukuyama, Political Order and Political Decay, chapters 5 through 8, lecture 1. These chapters concern the nature of corruption and introduce notions of patronage, clientelism, and social capital or trust in order, in part, to explain why Greece and Italy have not been nearly as successful as Germany in building a competent central state. Fukuyama's basic argument in the chapters ahead is that Greece and Italy, they could not build the kind of competent state that Germany built because they were low trust societies to begin with. And then they democratized before a competent state had been built. And that meant that over the course of the 19th and 20th century, as the state was being built, it became an instrument of clientelistic politics. And as a result, Greece and Italy ended up with bloated public sectors that were at the same time inefficient and oftentimes not particularly competent. And the inefficiency and the incompetence of the public sector thereby actually reinforced the low trust and the cynicism about government that already existed. And so you have kind of a vicious circle there in a way. And then in chapter 8, we get a brief story of how Britain was actually able to reform itself out of patronage politics and into a competent state in the 19th century through the efforts of a relatively small group of well-connected elites made up predominantly of aristocrats and ambitious middle-class strivers. So that's kind of the success story. Then in the next set of lectures, or the next chapters, we'll be talking about 19th century America and clientelism and state building. So chapter 5, which is entitled Corruption, this begins on page 81 of the book. Corruption, one of the main reasons why people concerned with political development today are concerned with corruption is because corruption is a major dampener of economic growth. The more corrupt a country is, the harder growth becomes. It diverts resources in unproductive areas. It effectively imposes extra taxation on people insofar as they have to bribe officials and such things. And also encourages rent seeking. It encourages people to, if there is a corruption, then they try to sort of get a piece of it rather than be one of the suckers that just has to pay bribes. It's better to be somebody that collects bribes. So it creates kind of perverse incentives for people to engage in what is ultimately not economically productive, extractive activity by trying to get some of the proceeds of corruption for themselves. It also damages political order. So alongside economic growth, corruption also damages the political order because it oftentimes reduces the legitimacy of the government. The government is not perceived as particularly legitimate, oftentimes correctly, depending on how it's acting. And it undermines social trust more broadly. So not just trust in the government, but even sort of trust in your neighbors, that the more corruption you have in a society, you might say, all other things being equal, the more predatory behavior you have, where people are sort of trying to take advantage of one another. And when you have a lot of predatory behavior, when you have a lot of corrupt activity in society, it becomes much harder to trust people, or at least to trust people outside of your immediate family. So corruption is damaging to political development and to economic development. Now, in the most basic sense, and he provides this definition on page 82, I believe, page 83, as he says, most definitions of corruption center around the appropriation of public resources for private gain. And that's normally how people think of it, this idea that there is tax money or other goods or services provided in some way by the state, and that those resources are appropriated by people for their own private use or private gain instead of for the public purposes that they are intended. And that is a good definition so far as it goes, but as he points out, that kind of definition of corruption presupposes the modern, or at least modernizing states, because to define corruption as the private appropriation of public resources is in effect to presuppose a distinction between public and private. And that distinction is relatively new. In any kind of older patrimonial order, or even when you think of something like the feudal system, and you think about the powers and the resources and the responsibilities of, say, a baron in a feudal country, there's not a strict definition between private and public for them, because their public powers, so to speak, are part of their private estate. And even the word state, comes from estate, which originally referred to in effect, the private dominion of the ruler. So, for example, in Machiavelli in The Prince and in the Discourses uses the term state, but he uses it in a way that refers primarily, not always exclusively, but refers primarily to the private resources and standing of the prince, as opposed to the state as a public realm. So you have to remember that the modern definition of corruption is very much modern, because it presupposes this distinction between public and private. So it requires that the state itself be seen as a kind of public trust, as opposed to the personal property of the rulers. And it also presupposes that public officials act in rule-defined ways. So it's quite modern. Now, he goes on then, after giving that sort of basic definition of corruption, to talk about some other forms of behavior that are oftentimes quite common politically, but don't necessarily constitute corruption in the full sense. So, for example, he talks about rent seeking. Now, a rent, for purposes here, you can just refer to as a benefit that comes from some kind of scarcity, especially in an artificial scarcity. So a rent, you could say, is the difference between the cost of something to have and what you can sell it for, right? And so usually the more scarce something is relative to demand, the more of the more profit you can make from it. And that's basically a rent. Now, for our purposes here, when talking about rent seeking, usually what you're talking about is a situation where you seek gain from some artificially created or governmentally imposed scarcity. So a classic example here would be something like, as he talks about, licensing, right? Where the government restricts activity in some area only to those who have a government license to engage in that activity, which, for example, a lot of states regulate the number of liquor stores there are, or they might regulate, cities might regulate how many taxi cabs there are, so that you basically have to have a license in order to engage in that activity. And that creates an artificial scarcity. If you didn't have to be licensed, there might be more people that would engage in that activity. And if more people engaged in that activity, generally speaking, when you increase the supply relative to the demand, that means the costs go down, which means the profit margin goes down. This is one of the reasons why, for example, taxi drivers have oftentimes been opponents of things like Uber and Lyft, because Uber and Lyft are in direct competition with taxi cabs. And by having more competition, it forces the taxi cabs to lower their rates. So a rent, you could think of kind of rent seeking as a situation where you seek to benefit from some governmentally created artificial scarcity. Patents are like this too. But also you could have things like, and this doesn't quite fit the same definition, but things like subsidies or grants. So the way that particular businesses or particular sectors can get governmental subsidies, can get money directly from the government. So that's not money that comes from providing a good on the market. It's provided by the government. And so rent seeking is not necessarily corruption, but it is a way of seeking gain from the government, as opposed to through market exchange and things like that. So another way of describing rent seeking is to say that it's the use of resources to gain some benefit without actually generating some kind of benefit or wealth in return, right? Like, so if you spend a lot of money lobbying Congress to get a subsidy, you have spent those resources in order to get some benefit from the government, but you haven't produced something. You haven't, say, produced something that people value and purchase and pay for. So whereas if you spend money producing some good to be sold on the market, you spend those resources, but in spending those resources, you produce something that other people value and pay for, right? And that way you've got some kind of exchange. Whereas in rent seeking, you're devoting resources to gaining some kind of benefit from the government, but you're not producing anything, right? You're just getting that gain. So like spending money to lobby Congress. This is what's sometimes referred to as socially wasteful activity, because those resources could have been put into something that would have been of value to others. But instead, that money is diverted away from production to lobbying so that you get your subsidy or what have you. So rent seeking is, obviously a questionable activity, but it is not necessarily the same thing as corruption in the strict sense. And governments can create rents, right? And that means, through subsidies, monopolies, licensing rules, and other things like that. Governments create rents, and that means that under some circumstances, ambitious people are going to devote resources to getting those benefits from the government instead of offering something on the market. Now, but creating rents or this kind of situation, again, it's not necessarily corrupt. It's not necessarily bad. As Fukuyama points out, certain forms of regulation will necessarily create rents. And that's not necessarily bad, right? Because, there might be circumstances where it makes a lot of sense to want to have only licensed practitioners engage in some kind of activity, right? And so if you use licensing rules to restrict, say, the number of people who can be doctors or the number of people who can do this, that, or the other thing, that is creating a rent, because you will have people that will devote resources to trying to get that license so that they can engage in that activity, right? And if those licenses weren't there, they wouldn't necessarily have to vote to devote the resources that they would need, right? There might be a lot of, if you didn't need a license to be a truck driver, for example, so people might not devote as much resources to getting trained to be a truck driver. So, regulation can create these artificial scarcities. And that's not necessarily bad. It says in part it depends on what is always going to be a controversial question, but whether the policy actually genuinely aims at the public good or not. Because there might be other circumstances where artificial scarcities are created where it clearly seems like a form of protectionism. A classic example that's oftentimes given is that there are a lot of localities, a lot of municipalities, where you have to get a license in order to give pedicures. And ostensibly, this is a public health measure, but most people recognize that kind of what this is it just sort of it protects pedicurists in effect by reducing competition, because if somebody wants to open up a shop, they've got to get a license, right? So it's a way of protecting existing pedicurists, or whatever the word is for it, from competition from others. So there's certainly cases where regulations, even if they are ostensibly for the public good, are really there as a form of handout or protection. But now we get to alongside rent seeking, there's a more important pair of concepts, which are patronage and clientelism. Patronage and clientelism, he introduces these on page 86. Now, when he talks about a patronage relationship, and this is something that goes, back almost to the beginnings of human society, as he says on page 85, a patronage relationship is a reciprocal exchange of favors between two individuals of different status and power, usually involving favors given by the patron to the client in exchange for the client's loyalty and political support. The favor given to the client must be a good that can be individually appropriated, like a job in the post office, or a Christmas turkey, or a get-out-of-jail-free card, or something like that. Now, that's patronage. Patronage is as old as the hills. Probably one of the more famous representations of patronage in popular culture is in the Godfather movies. The Godfather begins with, what's his name, Amerigo Bonacera, asking the Godfather for a favor. And the Godfather says, I'll grant you this favor, and in return, I might need something from you later on down the line. And I won't give away any spoilers. Go see The Godfather. It's a good movie. I once gave a lecture on The Godfather in the dorms at UD, but that was back when there were dorms before all the coronavirus stuff. So maybe at some point in the future too. So patronage is usually considered to be kind of a direct relationship between the patron and the client, whereas clientelism is a little bit different. Clientelism involves having a middleman, so to speak, that it's distinguished from patronage in terms of scale. As he says this on page 86, patronage is sometimes distinguished from clientelism by scale. Patronage relationships are typically face-to-face ones between patrons and clients and exist in all regimes, whether authoritarian or democratic. Right? Because you always have people with differing status and people who need favors and all that kind of stuff. Clientelism thus exists primarily in democratic countries where large numbers of voters need to be mobilized. What is traditionally referred to as the patronage system in American politics was, by this definition, actually a clientelistic system, since it involved the mass party organizations distributing widespread favors through complex, hierarchical political machines. Right. So in other words, in clientelism, you've got middlemen, right? You have a party boss, and then you've got the people that work right under him, and then you got, so you got your like captains, your lieutenants, and you got your foot soldiers, out, so you've got a hierarchical organization, and in that hierarchical organization, at the bottom you have the clients, which, in the case of like a political party, an old patronage-based political party, would be your voters. And the idea is that through these middlemen, party bosses would do things like distribute favors, distribute jobs, distribute other private benefits of one sort or another in return for the votes of the clients, the sort of average people. So these old patronage style parties, they built their political support by basically providing favors for voters, and in return, voters provided votes for the leaders. And that's a clientelistic relationship. So obviously it belongs to larger kind of societies, usually ones where there's voting, and the party machines would provide individualized benefits. These would be private goods, jobs, favors, cash, and stuff like that in return for votes. Now, overall, the argument can be made that clientelism is not a good thing, right? Because it can lower the quality of government. There are higher costs involved because you got to dole out a bunch of favors, and the people might be promoted and get jobs because of having good connections as opposed to being competent. So it's going to be less professional, right? Perhaps less competent. It can strengthen existing elites while at the same time sort of shielding them from genuine accountability, right? Because they hold their power on the basis of all these favors and wealth they can dole out. And really, if you want to get into it, he talks about it a little bit later in the book. The crusade in the 19th century, the basically kind of middle class crusade for the creation of a professional civil service in the United States was in its initial stages, really a response against the corruption of the party machines in a lot of the major urban centers of the country. So, clientelism on the whole is probably not a good thing, although, if there were time, I would offer a little bit more of a defense of it than I have time here. So if you're interested in that, you can send me an email or whatever. I'm happy to talk about it. But the point he goes on to make in on page 88 and thereafter is that patronage and clientelistic style activity is really rooted in nature, right? Because it follows, it's something like it follows out of this basic notion of reciprocal altruism. The fact that people organize their social activity in part through, the kind of the exchange of benefits with friends. So it is quite natural. And as even Fukuyama says at the end of the chapter, clientelism is in some ways a beneficial early stage of democratization because it at least creates a kind of reciprocity between the powerful and the less powerful, because it is the case that these party bosses do have to deliver the goods in order to get the support, right? So it's not simply just kind of rapacious extraction, right? Like Tammany Hall in New York, however corrupt it might have been, however incompetent it might have been at times, it was still, better by several orders of magnitude than the rule of somebody like Robert Mugabe, right? Because there was at least some kind of exchange. There's a quid pro quo. And it's also the case that clientelism, as he says, it can encourage mass participation. So it can bring a lot of people into the electoral process that otherwise might be outside of it, right? That's the patronage politics or clientelistic politics was the way that a lot of immigrants were first brought into the US system. This is illustrated. There's an old movie by Martin Scorsese called The Gangs of New York. I wouldn't recommend the movie, but there's a scene where you have a bunch of immigrants getting off the boat, basically at Ellis Island, and you've got representatives of Tammany Hall with clipboards basically right there registering them to vote. Right? Because for the party machines, these immigrants were a source of power, they were a source of votes, but it was also a way of bringing the immigrants into the system. That's why, for example, in New York, you have the kind of the stereotypical Irish cop, right? Why is it that there was this stereotype that developed in the 1800s and early 20th century in the United States that, cops were Irishmen in New York? Well, the reason why is because a lot of Irish immigrants exchanged votes for jobs as policemen, right? So that's part of this, we're pushing broom for City Hall or whatever. Even that's the way a lot of people were brought into the system. So this is why he says, kind of near the end of the chapter, that clientelism is really kind of proper to less developed societies where there are fewer opportunities to get ahead through the market, right? Like if you don't have a really dynamic market yet, or you don't have a lot of widespread opportunities, one of the ways you can advance socially is by getting involved in these patronage networks. So there is corruption, whether you're talking about patronage or rent seeking or clientelism, and you should know what all those terms mean. There is obviously at times or even often corruption involved in those practices, but they are not identical with corruption, and they all tend to have their place here and there. So in the next lecture, I'll move on to talking about Greece and Italy and their failure to build a competent state because they got enmeshed in democratic clientelistic politics before an independently competent state could be built.